I want to welcome everybody for coming. This is great attendance, and please sign your name so that we have a record that you were here, if you don't mind. This is the first of the second set of Springs Academies we've done. We've done for the last 6 months, the first Tuesday of every month, we've had a lecture here. This is the schedule for the next 6 months. We'll do an overview today. The next time will be hydrogeology, the geology of the Florida aquifer, the movement of water in the Florida aquifer, what that does for spring flows. In December, we'll talk about the chemistry, the nutrients, the general chemistry, pH, dissolved oxygen, nutrients, trace contaminants. And then we'll have a lecture on springs biology. And these lectures are similar to last year, but I'll add new things to them every time. So if you have seen them before, it's not just refreshing, there's also new information that's coming in that I roll into my presentations. And we'll talk about the stresses, really the impairments that are occurring in our springs, some of which we saw when we were paddling on the Silver River the other day. I don't know if you saw the bright green algae up near the head spring and those springs up there, just masses of bright green algae and stuff like that from pumping and fertilizer. And then the last lecture is about sort of what the public can do, what the public's having to do. We have to take this issue in our own hands to do something about it because our state government is crippled by politics, unfortunately, and they're not doing their job. So that's the reason I'm doing these classes. Certainly, one of the reasons we have a Springs Institute. Be glad to have it. Oh wow, Paul Marafino's here. Come on in, Paul. Welcome. Is anybody else coming with you?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for coming out. And we're just starting. So I'm Bob Knight, the director of the Institute. I have a scientific background. I was trained as I started in physics. Ended up in zoology, and got a master's in public health, environmental chemistry, and then got a PhD in ecology at the University of Florida. So I did my doctoral research in Silver Springs. I've been, involved with springs for a long time, since the 70s, academically and scientifically, but really focusing on in the last about 15 or 16 years. And I wrote this book that is for sale here that is sort of everything I know about springs. If you want a bedroom reading, it's really good. It helps you go to sleep at night. There's where we were day before yesterday. We paddled. We just had a spring summit for any of you that don't know. Really very well attended event and very informative. A lot of I think we had 55 different speakers at that event. 55 speakers in 2 days, and everybody got 5 minutes to talk. So it was not boring. So you got everybody's information really fast, no more than 5 slides, and if they had slides at all. And we had like 62 different presentations in 2 days, and it was like more than 30 a day. But then the last day, to relax, I paddled all the way out to Lars. Thank you for coming. Wow, the expert's here. Luckily, I'm not doing the natural history. Lars is going to tear me apart. So we paddled out to Silver Springs, and that's an aerial view by Harley Means, Geological Survey. The Springs Institute is named after this gentleman, Howard T. Odum. He was a professor all over the country, but he ended his career. He started his career and ended it at the University of Florida. He started in Florida in 1950 and taught for about 4 years. Did a major study of Silver Springs during those 4 years, and then he came back in 1970, which is the year I met him. I met him in Chapel Hill before he came to Florida. Came with him to Florida. in 70, and then we restudied Silver Springs. He was my major professor in 79 and 80 at Silver Springs, and that's a picture during that time. And so he published all the original science, and the science that he published in the 50s is still valid today. He was a really good scientist in terms of doing experimental work and documenting things and bringing large groups of researchers together. So it wasn't just him, there were at least 20 people working on that project. And then he had a bunch of other really big projects during the rest of his career. So the purpose of the Academy is to introduce you to water resources in Florida. The water is the essence of Florida, really, the life of us as humans, of the animals, of the native environment. And Florida is faced with major water resource issues from coast to coast, from the Keys to the Panhandle. Springs, understanding what's going on with springs and how they work and what's happening to them is a very good case history for everything else that's happening in Florida. You hear about the problems in the St. Lucie and in Okeechobee and in Apalachicola Bay. These are all interconnected problems resulting from the same basic impacts, and they need to be dealt with in the same ways. So we need a lot of knowledgeable people and talented people. It doesn't do any good going out and screaming that the sky is falling all the time, because if you don't have the facts, you're not going to get anywhere. People are just going to discredit you. So having the facts is really important to being able to convince your neighbors, but also to convince your politicians, which we all need to be working on. So I want you to understand the occurrence and importance of springs. In these 6 lectures, if you're able to come to them, I think you'll have a pretty good idea. And this is like an abbreviated course that I taught at the University of Florida. I taught Springs Ecology at the University of Florida for 3 years. And then I've done a lot of short schools. So you're going to get it all just at lunchtime. And you're not sacrificing, because you go get lunch afterwards if you're hungry. I go get lunch, and everybody's welcome to join me. So you develop not working knowledge, just not about where the springs are, but how many there are, what their flows are, what their ecology is, and also their importance to the economy. You definitely gain an appreciation of their complexity. Springs are just wonderful to just view, but when you start understanding them, it gets that much better. It's just like anything in nature. When you really start looking at the details, it's fascinating, and springs are equally fascinating. And then you can help be the decision makers for the future. So I'm going to start right into definitions. Karst is the type of geology that we live on. The karst geology is one where the landform has been modified by rocks that dissolve. And our rocks that dissolve are primarily limestone. And so you're all knowledgeable about those. He's standing right on the dissolved limestone. This limestone was all laid down in nice layers, stratigraphic layers from sea level, from ocean environments. It was laid down, and then there were times when Florida was not under the ocean, when it was raining, and the rain, with this natural acidity in rain, dissolved a lot of the limestone. And so that's where these solution cavities in limestone came from. There are original fracture lines in the limestone that you can actually see when you start lining up sinkholes and things like that. You can actually do a fracture trace analysis, and that's where the caves are likely to be, is along those fracture lines. That's where the sinkholes form, because there was, that was a place where water could get into the limestone and start dissolving. An aquifer, we talk a lot about the Floridan aquifer. It's not the Florida aquifer, it's the Floridan. I don't know why they named it that way, but that's the proper name for it. Is any source of groundwater that's used for drinking, or that's used by humans, really. So an aquifer is any source of groundwater that's used by humans. That can be the shallow groundwater. That can be the groundwater, you dig a hole in your yard, and if you've got clay 10 feet down, you may have water 2 or 3 feet down in your yard. Some people's septic tanks don't work very well because of that. That's an aquifer if it's used, if you tap it as a water supply. The Florida aquifer that I'm talking about is a very big aquifer. But you see, an aquifer is a wide interpretation, wide meaning. This is what the Floridan aquifer looks like. It's got some really big caves in it and caverns in it. This is down at Weeki Wachee Springs. Cave divers have gone to 400 feet below ground surface in Weeki Wachee Springs, 400 feet below the water surface there. And those caves come together and put out the water, discharge the water that ultimately comes out of Weeki Wachee Springs, and the Weeki feeds the whole Weeki Wachee River. But this is what some of them look like. Many of the caves are much smaller than this, cracks and crevices. And then there's parts of the aquifer where there's no cave at all, so you've got solid rock. So those areas don't hold much water. You know, the areas that hold most of the water, where most of the water moves around the aquifers, the caves, because that's where water can move freely. And we actually heard from a hydrogeologist at the summit that, oh, the water doesn't move very fast through the caves. Well, he's wrong. The tide and cave got up and put up his dietary studies. It moves 1,000 feet a day in some of these caves. You can't even swim against the current in many of these caves, and so they have scooters to help them move. So when if you go downstream in the cave, you might have to get back up to the outlet in the cave, and that's happened before. And that's why people wouldn't go in Springs Creek, because there was such a severe backflow there. They were worried about being sucked all the way to the Cullo. You wouldn't have any airlines by the time you got to the Cullo Springs. But anyway, caves are underground rivers. They're literally underground rivers of water, these caves. The water's all flowing downhill. That's the way water flows. You've heard that cliche. Well, these brown lines are the topographic surface of the aquifer. It's called a potentiometric surface. It's the surface that if you put hundreds of wells, and there are literally millions of wells in North Florida in the ground, the water level in those wells is the potentiometric surface. It's the surface that's dictated by the pressure of the water in the aquifer. And so here, this is in Polk County, 130 feet. The aquifer, the ground surface may be 200 feet. Okay. This isn't the land surface, this is the groundwater surface. It's 130 feet. This is an area of high pressure that then directs groundwater. Water's flowing downhill to the outlets. And the outlets are the springs. That's what these blue and red dots are. Those are the low spots where there happens to be a hole in the limestone. And that's where the water can escape. And that's all springs are. But a potentiometric surface, you need to understand, is the surface of groundwater levels. Potentiometric surfaces vary based on rainfall. So if it rains a lot over here, the surface will rise as the water mounds under where it's raining a lot. But this is an area of relatively high recharge, but it's also an area of fairly low hydraulic connectivity through the rock. And so that's why the lines, the topographic lines of potentiometric surface are close together in areas where there's very slow slower groundwater movement. The lines are close together, where they're far apart. That means the aquifer is really porous and water can really flow quickly through those areas. And so we actually draw spring sheds. Well, I'll get to it. This aquifer is artesian, which means it's under pressure. Parts of the aquifer are covered with sediment. In fact, in this area, the aquifer is covered with plagues and things like that, so there's really not that high a recharge rate there. And the water is under pressure there, and that pressure creates an artesian flow. So these springs, when they're healthy and flowing well, you actually see a boil of water on the surface. And that you get that only in a confined aquifer. There are springs that are called seeps that occur on the side of hills, and where there's clay down low and there's a hill that comes down, water that seeps down, say, through that sand and hits that clay will come out at the base of the slope. That's a seep, and that's just gravity pressure that's pushing that water out. Artesian pressure is different. There's actually pressure in the aquifer. You may draw water out of an aquifer without actually lowering the real water level. You lower the potentiometric surface, but you won't lower the water level because the water's under pressure and it's down in a confined part of the aquifer. You'll hear more of these later. But those potentiometric maps allow us to draw spring sheds around a spring. Silver Springs is right here on the east side of Ocala. It's a very big spring, probably the biggest spring in the world in terms of historic flows. Flows into the Aquifer River through the Silver River that we canoed in on Saturday, Sunday. But the spring shed that feeds it is about, I think it's 1,700 square miles or something like that. It's, almost 1 million acres of land is what it takes to recharge the aquifer with enough water to feed Silver Springs continuously. So the average flow of Silver Springs was about 500 million gallons a day for the first 80 years of its record. We started getting data in the 1800s, and up until the 1960s, it was still flowing at that rate. That water was from this giant storage over this whole area that was being recharged. Spring sheds change in size due to rainfall. Like I said, when it rains, when it doesn't rain, spring shake is larger and smaller. It turns out they also change in response to pumping. Talk more about that later. So, and when geologists drew a representation of a cross-section, a vertical cross-section through the limestone in the Florida Aquifer, they draw the rock as these blocks, and they show it blocky. It's not really looks like that, but you've seen what limestone looks like. And you have sinkholes where the limestone's collapsed, where there was a cavity like this that caved in. You have springs where there's enough pressure in the aquifer from this level up here to actually push water out of the spring. You have submarine springs out in the ocean that are now, sometime in the past, were putting out fresh water, but now apparently all just putting out salt water because the salt water is intruded into the aquifer along the coast of most of Florida. And so that's just a general thing. But a spring is anywhere where this groundwater comes to the surface. That's the definition of a spring. It's just anywhere where groundwater comes to the surface. So here's a diver coming to the surface at Blue Springs, Blue Springs. And so that's a picture that sort of represents what a spring really looks like. Since these springs are artesian, they actually have excess pressure to bring this water out. They actually create a boil sometimes, more in the past than in the present. They made boils like this. This is the Mill Pond Springs at Introductory. And John got a good picture of a boil when they're pumping. You can really see that. In fact, people said you used to be able to hear the water coming out of springs. The head spring at Introductory, the old timers, so you could actually hear the water coming out in the past.
Bob, where is Mill Pond Springs?
Mill Pond Creek, there's a sign that says don't go up here.
Oh.
It's down after the rice marsh, just before you go into the forest on Introductory. You know what I'm talking about?
After the rice marsh.
It's right at the end of the rice marsh. You start going around the corner. The manatees are frequently right there at the mouth of this. Go up that sign. It's an enormous sign.
Yeah.
And this is it's real shallow here. You've got to wade through it. But come on up and see it. It's really neat. And there was a mill. The rock has actually been cut where they had a mill wheel in there. They had a dam and a mill wheel in there 100 years ago. And Lars knows the whole history. So the spring pool we talked about, like this is in silver. All that water coming out of there has the ability to dissolve more limestone, right? So if the spring is putting out a lot of water, the spring gets bigger over time. It's eroding the limestone. And so when we see a really big spring pool like the one at McCullough, we know that there was a time in the past when that had a lot higher flow than it has now. And silver is a big pool. This pool is about 300 feet across, about 100 yards across. And that's and this is where half the flow of the Silver River comes from. It's this cave right here, Mammoth Spring. That water comes blasting out of there and does this movement like this. And you can actually see the current. When you pull your kayak in here, you'll start drifting around like this, and then you go downstream. The other half of the water comes, there's like 24 other springs on the Silver River that feed the other half of the flow. So a spring pool is a good representation of how big that spring was, at least sometime in the past during geologic time. This is the rice marsh in the Introductory. A spring run is any stream that is more than half of the average flow is from spring fed. So the Introductory is almost 100% of the flow is from springs. But if you think about the St. Johns River, if you look at the historic data, over half the flow in St. Johns River was from springs. So it's a spring run. The whole St. Johns River, the Swanee River, is a spring run by the definition. And then there's many things you recognize more, like Blue Springs Run, the Weehee-Washy River, and the Homosassa River. They're all spring runs. Okay, where are our springs? Well, they are mostly in North Florida. They're from Tampa or I-4, we say, north. There's only a few springs south of that, War Mineral Springs in Sarasota County and Salt Springs down Sarasota County. There's like 3 existing artesian springs further south. But any other springs are pretty much gone. There were some in Polk County. Kissington Springs dried up in the 50s on the East River. But they're really, most of the springs are north. The green dots are just some of the springs. We've got a list now. It's over 1,000 springs. It seems to be going up. Somebody mentioned 1,100 at this meeting on the current list. And the biggest ones are shown here in green. The biggest concentration is in the Swanee River Basin. This is the Swanee River here. These are in the Santa Fe River here. These are the springs that feed that. Like I said, both those rivers turn totally clear in a dry year. They're just amazing. You can see everything. I've swam in the Swanee River here. We can see sturgeons going by, crystal clear. It's all spring flow during the summertime. More in the past than currently. And the Santa Fe, many times, the whole river will be clear. And then the springs go all the way out to the furthest part of the panhandle. And so the brown area was an area delineated by the Florida Springs Initiative, the Florida Geological Survey, to delineate the springs area. And it's about I think it's like 36 or 37 counties out of Florida's 67 counties are in this spring region. And there's actually 50-some counties in Florida that would draw water from the Florida Aquifer, which is the aquifer that feeds these springs. So there's some statistics like that in my book. I don't remember the exact numbers. So this is a slide from Pat Seaman, who was with the Center for Earth Jurisprudence. Water is the source of all life. It nourishes us. We can't live without water. We are water, as Jill Heinert says. And we're over 70% of your body is water. All life is based on water. All life that we know of. And that's why they're always looking for signs of water on Mars and the Moon and places like that to try to see if there could have been life there. But it's absolutely essential. It's Ginny Springs. And springs support a really unique ecology. I mean, there's no other place in Florida where you get the accumulation of manatees, the striped bass accumulation you get in the springs along the St. Johns River, these little turtles that live on the snails in springs, and certain plant communities. And all these things come together in a unique ecology, a unique structure and function of springs that I talk about in one of my lectures later. Just some of John's pictures, the striped bass at Silver Glen. And then springs provide enormous economic benefits. That's a low estimate. Just the data presented by Dana Bryant on Friday indicate that about $360 million a year in 2014, just from the springs and state parks. That's like 17 spring systems. And then this, when you add up the other value that comes from the privately owned springs and the springs that are in county parks and places like that, we're close to $1 billion a year of just wealth that we're getting to our economy from these springs. The fact that they're flowing, and the fact that people want to go to them, the fact that people want to live near them. So, and these are some of the activities. I've seen people kayak. These are all manatees, and Three Sisters are right adjacent to Three Sisters. They can't all fit in the spring. These are people at Rock Springs. This is a neat spring. It actually just jumps right out of a limestone wall there, and so it's really neat. Our local Gilchrist Blue Springs, Weeki Wachee, Itchtucknee River, Alexander Springs, Kaiva Springs. And springs inspire people. I mean, there's a lot of people that think springs literally are sacred. I mean, they think they're just magical. I've met people that I would sort of label as crazy that say they can actually feel the power and the energy coming out of springs. And it's probably not crazy. It's just things that not everybody can sense. And some people can sense that. So artists have been describing that in springs for a long time. Silver Springs, of course, has a long history of you basically don't even know you're in the water in these pictures except for a few bubbles. The water's so clear in our springs. And then there's mixtures like the Santa Fe River where Ginny Springs comes out and mixes with the Santa Fe River. Just amazing art created by those. The exploration of springs by divers like Wes Stiles and Margaret Tolbert, her art, which we have over here showing. Actually, this is Silver Springs now, isn't it?
This is a Lost Spring.
The Lost Spring?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We'll see the brown water coming into the spring. That's what she's representing in that painting. So, one of the reasons that you're here is because we're having problems with our springs. And if the springs were just all peaches and cream, we'd just be out in the springs right now. I wouldn't be boring you with having to sit in a chair. Because they're wonderful. I mean, they still are wonderful, and we're lucky that we still have them. But they're being threatened. And if the public doesn't stand up, it appears that there's development and profit, greed, things like that will actually destroy our springs. And some have already succumbed to that very greatly. And those problems are related to groundwater pumping, to the use of fertilizer, and so nitrogen pollution of our springs, both from fertilizer and from wastewater, both animal and human wastewater, from saltwater intrusion, and from just too much recreation. And this is a picture of Mill Pond Springs at the other end. This is the outlet where Dina Leibowitz did her doctoral research. She studied the effect of snail grazing on algae in that spring. And she's looking, this is the algae she's pulling out of the spring. It's terribly filled with algae now that it didn't used to have. So I'm going to go over those problems real quickly. These are, every one of these dots is a permitted withdrawal of water from the Florida Aquifer. I've only got 3 of the water management districts here: the Southwest District, the St. John's District, the Swanee River District, and there's 29,000, almost 29,000 permits in those districts already that authorize the pumping of about 4.6 billion gallons every day. And those aren't all wells. There's another million plus wells, private wells, that are below the threshold for these permits. You don't need a permit to get a private well. And so the total pumping from the aquifer is estimated right now about 2.5 billion gallons a day. It's been sort of holding steady, but we seem to still be losing ground on the aquifer, and that probably has to do with water conservation and other issues. But it's about 30% of the total recharge of the aquifer. And if everybody, during a dry year, people pump more from their wells, right? Agriculture will lose their crop if they don't pump. And so everybody is likely to pump up to the maximum level. So in a dry year, when we have the least amount of recharge, the least amount of spring flow, is when we pump the most. And we have, right now, the permitted allocation is half of all the spring flow in Florida. Half the average recharge is already permitted. We're so far beyond sustainable, it's not even funny. And we were at the summit with the state agencies. They're explaining to us how, pumping is only causing a 1% reduction in spring flow at Rainbow Springs. Right, Paul? 1%. And we can go ahead and take it down another 7% or another 6%. So, I mean, that's how far off our agencies are right now, because they're using very flawed groundwater models that we heard about from Todd Kincaid, and who spent the last 2 nights at my house talking to me for hours about the models are really bad that are being used to justify these permits. And so this is our biggest problem with springs. We're pumping too much water from the aquifer. We need to find a way to live our lives without using so much groundwater. And what am I missing? Something coming?
Someone was peeking.
Oh, good. Yeah. Maybe they're getting done. So what happens when you pump too much water? Well, it lowers the water level in the aquifer. Remember I showed that real high in Polk County? Well, it's still, water levels are still high there. The water is still flowing to the coast. But the water level actually in Polk County has gone down more than 60 feet. 60 feet, groundwater level has fallen by 60 feet. So if you're a spring sitting there like this bucket, and the water's coming into the surface of the aquifer, and the aquifer is really deep, doesn't help you a bit. If you're a spring, you're just a hole in the aquifer, up here, and the water has to overflow out of that hole to be a spring. As soon as the groundwater level is pumped down to the point where it's below the orifice of the spring stops flowing. And we have beautiful examples of that. Kissington Spring was the first one that Odum wrote about in the 50s that dried up, and it was because of phosphate mining and citrus industry, basically industrial uses of water primarily, and now more than that, agricultural uses. Polk County has the highest water use of any county in the Florida Aquifer, pulling from the Florida Aquifer, 250 million gallons a day on average in Polk County, just from that one county. And it's no wonder they have a big hole. Tampa is also over 200 million gallons a day. The district is about 1 billion gallons a day. It's got and the other big places we see drawing up, the Jacksonville area, there's almost no recharge in Jacksonville because the aquifer is very confined by clay layers, over 100 feet of clay over the aquifer here. So there's really no recharge. But Jacksonville's pumping over 100 million gallons a day, just the city is, and that's pulling the aquifer down all along the coast. Then you've got paper mills right up here at Fernandina Beach and Brunswick, Georgia, that are very big users of groundwater with 50 million gallons a day, 30 million gallons a day each, and they're pulling the aquifer level down. So the reddish areas are the areas where the aquifer is pulled down. The areas where the highest recharge is, the rigs are in the Swanee River District, the aquifer level is about the same as it was historically. But it's not exactly the same. So it's a very small reduction in the aquifer level in those areas can result in a very large reduction in spring flows. So what we're seeing, Silver Springs, which had historically the highest spring flow, over 800 cubic feet per second up until the 1960s, started declining really seriously after that time. In Rainbow, which had the second highest spring flow, and there, Silver was always about 70 cubic feet per second higher than Rainbow all the time. All of a sudden, Silver just started plunging down 38% this year. Even with the last few years of high rainfall, it's about 38% below its historic flow now. And it's down below Rainbow. Rainbow is coming down too, but not quite as fast as Silver. And we think that Rainbow Springs, because it's lower in the landscape, is actually pirating flow from Silver Springs. I showed you the spring shed for Silver. One of the lectures later, if you come, I'll show you the two spring sheds are right adjacent to each other. Silver and Rainbow, two of them combined, put out over 1,000 CFS, about almost 1 billion gallons a day of water on average. So these are giant springs in terms of flow, but they're being impacted, both of them. You see the ragged plots are the annual average flows. And so springs flow goes up and down in relation to rainfall. If it's a wet year, you get high spring flows. If it's a dry year, you get lower spring flows. Well, so there's the lowest Silver ever went, this old historic record. And it's not that low again until the last couple of decades. Silver's been getting lower and lower. Each drought is showing more exposure of low flow. Silver actually got down to less than 20% of its historic flow during the 2012 drought. And it's been predicted that, if we have a bigger drought than 2012, Silver will actually stop flowing in our lifetime, which is unbelievable. So this is what a spring looks like with flow. This is White Springs in the 1920s. And of course, you've probably seen this picture by John Moran. This is what White Springs looked like when it stopped flowing in the 60s. And up through 2011 around the drought period. Swanee River's back there. All spring is a hole in the ground. That's all it is. That's all it will be again when the aquifer levels fall. If we are bold enough to pump the aquifer down another 10 or 20 feet, Silver Springs will stop flowing. All the springs on the Swanee River will stop flowing. I mean, that's actually, Todd and I were talking about it at breakfast this morning. What do I expect in the next 10 years? Well, if we're crazy enough to keep extracting more groundwater, which we seem to be based on our government, we're going to dry up more and more springs, and they're going to look like this. So that's the biggest problem with those springs. I mean, a spring that's not flowing isn't a spring anymore. It's lost the day. It becomes a sinkhole or a stagnant pond. So that's the biggest problem with springs. That kills the spring totally. The next biggest problem is the pollution we're putting into our springs. A typical fertilizer application rate is about 200 pounds per acre per year. In rainfall, you get about 3 pounds per acre per year. So historically, before modern agriculture, we were getting this much nitrogen going into the aquifer, and that resulted in a very low concentration of nitrogen in the groundwater. It's 0.05 parts per million, so 50 parts per billion. It's a very low amount. You can't see it at all. It's dissolved. But now, with this kind of agriculture, we're getting much higher levels of nitrogen. The blue is really the areas of the state where the groundwater is still down less than 0.2. Remember I said historic level is about 0.05. So a lot of the state is protected by confining layers, and fertilizer put on the surface doesn't affect the aquifer, the drinking water aquifer. But the areas where the aquifer is unconfined, which is where the springs are the most affected. Polk County is the most polluted groundwater in the state. And I just talked yesterday, I got interviewed yesterday about the Mosaic sinkhole. So Craig Pittman and I were on Sirius Radio, nationwide or worldwide, a talk radio show about Polk County and Mosaic. So that's really contaminated there with nitrate up over 10 parts per million, which is a human drinking water standard. The standard for springs is anything above green is a violation. So the majority of our springs are, over 70% of our springs are in violation of our water quality standards now for the state. And we've just really contaminated a very large part of our aquifer by the way we're living on the land right now. We're talking a lot about this. So flow up of Alachua County. Here's High Springs right here. You see, if you're drinking water here in High Springs, you're drinking water over a part per million. Here in this orange here. Okay. Spring standards here. So all of our springs along the Santa Fe River, all the ones that are flowing well, have high nitrate now. Gilchrist Blue has the highest, over 2 parts per million. And you can see why, because that's what the groundwater is. In Marion County, it's the areas that are unprotected by the Hawthorne Formation, the Hawthorne clays that are contaminated. So it's the western part of this county, the western part of this county, all of Suwannee County and some of these other counties.
Now, where's the Murphy well field? It's just to the right of that little red star.
Yeah, this is where Gainesville is, so it's the Murphy
It's
well field.
9.5.
Yeah, the Murphy well field's actually low, so I don't know why this plot is so big here, but we've got more detailed data. I'm not going to show it today. So this is the data for Rainbow Springs showing the nitrate levels over time, starting in the 1920s, the first reading, very low, down, like I said, around 0.05 during that time, gradually rising. To the 1980s, it was up to, the current spring standards, 0.35 right there. And since then, Rainbow's just going off like a rocket ship in terms of its nitrate accumulation. It's getting worse every year. There's nothing being done that's stopping the worsening of the effect. And there's very little being done to reverse this, to make it better.
Wouldn't the people along the river there, with all those homes along
The septic tank
Yeah,
drainage,
yeah.
there are some septic tanks there, and some of that is getting into the river, but it's minuscule compared to what's coming in from the spring boils. Most of this nitrogen is coming in from the boil. All of this are actually measured at the spring boil. The blue data are all at the boil, and the red data are moved to the monitoring station just downstream from the boil. So there's no houses upstream of that station. That is what's coming in from the spring shed.
But I would think the residents would be mad about that crap.
There's one of them here.
Yes.
There's a wonderful environmental group down there called Rainbow River Conservation that's been around since 64. Yeah, so it's like the oldest in Springs environmental group in the state, way before the French were time. And they've been dealing with these types of issues for a long time. So we're collaborating with them. I mean, they're collaborators. They helped us do the Rainbow Springs restoration and stuff like that. We have a meeting next week with the state agency about they're setting minimum flows for Rainbow right now, which I told you, their model says only 1% reduction in pumping, and that's nonsense. The total flow reduction is about 25%, and at least half of that's due to pumping. So we're going to be meeting, we're fighting battles with all our friends, and Rainbow River is one of them. They don't like this. But there's other problems at Rainbow too. Recreation is an enormous problem. It's with all the tubing, and of course they used to water ski on Rainbow Springs, but there weren't as many people water skiing as there are tubing. There's thousands of people tubing. And this is what some of our springs are looking like. They're really getting dense populations of filamentous algae. The native plants here, where in this one, this valve scenario, are eelgrass, and it's killing the plants. And we don't understand everything that's causing this, but it's associated with the increase in nitrate and nitrogen in springs. Nitrate is not the clear cause of this in every case. This picture is actually from a spring that doesn't have elevated nitrate. And yet there's a lot of algae. So it's related to the oxygen content of the water. It's related to the amount of recreation in the water, how much that's impacting the plants. And the algae can keep plants under certain conditions. So this is what silver looks like. And there's a statue. Somebody said they didn't see them on the paddle. Did anybody see them? They were hard to see because they were really dark. They hadn't been cleaned lately. And I was taking random pictures out of the kayak, and they were in the picture, so I know they're still down there. Manatee Springs is unbelievable. It's lost all its native vegetation. It's all algae now. And some of the algae filamentous algae is 10 to 12 feet long. It streams in the water, and this is what it looks like. It's the saddest sight in the world, if you remember Wikiwachi. These people are getting pissed about these things, and they're taking matters in their own hands. They're going out with rakes and actually raking the algae out of some of our springs. There's a group, one rake at a time in Kings Bay, and they have spread down the coast to Wikiwachi, and they're trying to fix the problems themselves. But the problems aren't there. This is what we call a haircut approach. I mean, as soon as you pull this algae out, it grows back. And the state has actually spent up to hundreds of thousands of dollars on some of these springs. Brad Rimby talked about the Chassahowitzka spring. They spent almost $1 million dredging out that spring, and the algae was all back in a year. So what good is that? It doesn't, you got to go to the roots of the problems, the source of the problems. And our own Santa Fe, this is right downstream from Highway 27 Bridge. If you know Santa Fe, those docks will look familiar to Leslie Campbell out there being a little bit dramatic with the gas mask, but nevertheless, it was really a bad sight when the river stopped flowing. The river just completely stopped flowing in 2012. Remember, the Santa Fe River is a spring run, so that means the water that's been feeding it has high nitrogen because it's a spring run and springs have high nitrogen. And so the river was full of nitrogen. When it stopped flowing in summer sunlight, early spring and summer sunlight, it just created an absolute cesspool. This is what all our springs will look like if we continue on the course we're on. This is what they're all going to look like in the fall. And I guarantee it. So we should be upset about these things, not just for our springs, but also this stuff's poison. Nitrate is actually acutely toxic in humans at high enough levels. We have a drinking water standard of 10, which is 30 times higher than our spring standard. And so supposedly 10 is safe to keep you from getting blue baby syndrome or methylglobinaemia, which affects babies and older people. You can't carry oxygen in your bloodstream because of it. But it also causes cancer, or at least there's strong evidence that nitrate causes cancer at much lower levels. And actually, levels right now that we're drinking here in High Springs or in surrounding areas. In your Zephyr Hills bottled water, 2 parts per million nitrate it's been implicated in 3 times risk of cancer, bladder cancer in women, and thyroid cancer and birth defects. So why are we doing this? Why are we putting up with this? It's because people don't know or don't care or think the government is really here to protect us. And I don't think so. So pumping is increasing, of course, because of population, and groundwater nitrate levels are increasing. Just some more examples. Wakulla Springs, what it used to look like in the 60s versus what it looks like now. John's picture of the Silver River, we just paddled this the other day. This is one segment of the river I remember well because I lost my light meter there in 1979. It fell out of the back of my boat and I had to swim the whole river to find it. It was down on the bottom. I actually found it, but it was right here. And John, this just happens to be where John took these pictures because it's sort of straightaway. And so you can see the difference in the color of the Silver Springs water. More and more Silver Springs water is green or brown rather than blue. Fanning Springs, the algae there, you had the native plants in the past, they have the algae now. That's the typical thing you see. And then whole springs turn into putrid when they stop flowing, like Levy Blue Spring. So it's important for us to advocate for these things, but to understand them and to
North Florida Springs. Breathtaking. Mysterious. Powerful flows of pure fresh water discharging from the Floridan Aquifer. The greatest known concentration of springs on Earth. Some 260 springs releasing over 2.8 billion gallons of water a day into the Suwannee, Santa Fe, Ichetucknee, and with Lacoochee rivers. This is the Springs Heartland, a recreational and nature lover's paradise, critical habitat for rare and endangered animals, a hydrogeological wonder visited and loved by people worldwide. Their sustaining source, an immense underground limestone aquifer, riddled with cracks, crevices, tunnels, and caves, all feeding their flow silently to the springs. We, the people of Florida, stand as the guardians of this grand gift of nature. Sadly, the Springs Heartland faces an uncertain future. The way we live our lives above this vulnerable aquifer determines the quality of the water and how much of it will flow forth from our springs. Our behaviors and actions have the ability to inflict significant harm. Elsewhere in Florida, springs have stopped flowing. Their once vibrant flora and fauna are now coated with a slimy, deadly film. Many of our beloved rivers are choked with toxic algae and chemicals discharging from these springs. Is this to be the fate of the Springs Heartland? By reflecting on the mistakes of the past, we can see into the future and provide clear and effective leadership to save our springs. It is imperative now that we recognize the magnificent splendor and natural wonder of our springs. They are unique. A rich and spectacular bounty of crystal clear water bursting out of the ground for all to enjoy. An unparalleled resource of unimaginable value and importance to all Floridians. Springs are the very soul of North Florida. Preservation is always smarter and cheaper than restoration. The cost of restoring the Everglades, $20 billion and rising. Why repeat the same mistakes when we know and understand the problem? We can safeguard North Florida springs now and into the future for a fraction of the cost. The opportunity stands before us, but we must take action now. An economically feasible, even profitable, low-impact, sustainable growth strategy is within reach with financial and political support from state leaders. And a strong community of citizens stands ready to lend its support, knowing that the fate of North Florida's economy and the future of our children are directly linked to the health of our springs. It was inspired vision and determination of exceptional leaders that preserved our country's most treasured national parks and resources. Our springs are spectacular jewels of nature and deserve the same protection. We have arrived at the point that will forever determine the fate of this precious resource. Will we embrace what we know must be done? Only through strong conviction and leadership can we establish a lasting legacy where springs flow pure and powerful for generations to come.